Hi, this is Dr. Lorenzo Neal, host of the Zero Today radio show on Blog Talk Radio and also the Zero Today YouTube channel, which you're watching now. Thank you. If you haven't done so, I want to invite you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications when we upload future videos. If you're not aware, today is the 5th anniversary of the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. And if you don't remember, the narrative that was promoted by this incident was that Michael Brown was an unarmed 18-year-old black man, or younger man, who was shot by a Ferguson police officer. And there were witnesses who gave account saying that Mike Brown, when approached by the officer, put his hands up and said, "Don't shoot." And so the slogan for following the incident immediately became, "Hands up, don't shoot." That led to a movement that undergirded that was already unfolding as the Black Lives Matter movement that began after the Trayvon Martin shooting, but gained a whole lot more momentum following Michael Brown's shooting. And if you're even more aware, you know that the grand jury there in St. Louis County did not indict the officer, and that non-indictment resulted in days of rioting in the small community of Ferguson, Missouri. I didn't go to that, so I can't really speak to all the events that happened prior to or during, but it went viral as far as news was concerned. This was a big thing because it stimulated the angst of young black Americans across the country, and not just young black Americans, but a lot of people, as they tried to make sense of the incident. And depending on what side of the aisle you were on, you bought into different narratives. On the right leaning, you bought into a narrative that Michael Brown, although he was just 18, he was a criminal. He was not a gentle giant. He was a beast. And not only did he assault the officer who later killed him, but he's the one who incited the incident to begin with. And so they were framing him as this thug. And if he were on the other side, the left side, Michael Brown was this 18-year-old fresh out of high school senior who was loved and adored by his mother and his father, who had anticipations of being something in life, and who on a very hot day in August decided that he wanted to go to the store and get a drink and whatever else he may have done, and that he submitted to all the requests of the officers, and the officers still took his life. And either one of those narratives still exists in the minds of persons today, so I will not advocate on either one. But I want to explore what has since happened. It is 5 years later, and Michael Brown's father, Michael Brown Sr., just recently did a video in which he expresses the desire for his son's case to be reopened. Both of his parents have become advocates for gun violence prevention. They've become advocates for young black men, and they've become advocates, and they've become a part of a group of families that nobody wants to be a part of. They lost their children, not just to gun violence, but gun violence by law enforcement. That's hard to live with, and they have taken that burden and have turned it into a strength, and they are doing things that is hopefully and helpfully, and helpfully, that's not even a word, but they are doing things that are empowering black communities to better engage not just law enforcement but themselves. So here it is 5 years later, and I did a show, and I put the link to the radio show that I did regarding the Black Lives Matter and the 5th anniversary of that and where we are now. And to be honest with you, I think we've made some progress, but we have not made a lot of progress, because as all movements, the Black Lives Matter movement has become politicized. And once it's politicized, the message gets tainted. Once the message gets tainted, the action in it itself gets questionable. And I'm not talking about the actors. I'm talking about the action. What people wanted to see happen as a result of the deaths and the death of Michael Brown and many others who lost their lives at the hands of law enforcement. We could give you a list, and we could call the name, but we won't do that. It has created this dissonance between not just ethnicities, not just race, but also class. Because once the city of Ferguson was uncovered and we were able to see the dynamics of that community, the demographics of the community. We were able to see how basically they were in bondage, seriously oppressed fiscally, with court fees that they couldn't afford, fines they couldn't afford. And so there was a lot of oppression there, and that oppression was expressed in the riots that happened once the officer was not indicted. And 5 years later, while we don't have the civil unrest as we saw in cities like Ferguson or in Baltimore following an incident there, or in other cities, we are not seeing the civil unrest. We are still seeing the dissonance, the after effects of those incidents. And because my study is in, I did my doctoral research in differentiation of self and family systems and the dynamics of that. One of the things that is a part of family systems is societal process. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to explore that particular facet of family. What role does society play in our implicit bias? Because we are all implicitly biased, whether we believe it or not. We, especially those who are not African American, those who are part of the majority ethnic group or race group, they don't see the bias. And oftentimes, and those of us who are in the privileged or privileged African Americans, we're not quite bougie, but we're a bit removed from the urban areas where most of the crime is, most of the poverty is, most of the high unemployment is. We're a bit removed from there. We have that same bias, that same implicit bias when we come into contact with those in the hood, from the hood. It is what it is. And here we are 5 years following the shooting of Michael Brown. 5 years removed from the rioting. 5 years removed from a lot of things. And the city of Ferguson did see some change. They saw political change. They have not really seen significant demographic change, even though that is happening. It is happening. But the reality is there's still a lot more to do. Gun violence and oppression go hand in hand. And I know people don't want to talk about it in this explicitly, but that's the reality. As a pastor, because of the community that I serve, where I live, and I serve and live in the exact same community. I don't live outside of the place where I pastor. In this urban area, I hear gunshots all the time. There's a large police presence, largely because, it's not a high crime area, but it is a crime area. And so my goal has been to create an engagement with both young people, young men, black men in particular, and law enforcement. Twice this year, my church has sponsored events where we partnered with the local police department, and we brought in the chief, and we brought in precinct commanders, We brought in just patrol officers to our children, to our young men, during church hours. One was one was explicitly on a Saturday morning where they came in and they not only talked about conflict resolution, but introduced themselves and help the children in the community, the young men in the community, get to see them, right? The other time we sponsored not only with the police department, but also with the local behavioral health services to bring in counselors, to bring in those persons who are, when it comes to mental health issues and concerns, as well as crime. We brought them into the church. We are creating a dialogue. We are creating opportunities to engage the community that we serve. We are called to serve this present age, our calling to fulfill. So we're doing that. There are a lot of opportunities for churches to engage in this capacity, and I think there are a lot of churches that are doing that, and we should commend those churches, those ministries, those parachurch organizations that are doing so. We should commend community leaders and community engagements, persons who are engaging the community, who are not preachers, not pastors, but they are just concerned citizens. I have a neighbor here, and one of the things that she understood, she tapped into, and I didn't even realize it. It's like, just by picking up the trash in this community helps her feel safer. I had never thought about it that way. And she approached me and she said, "Pastor, I see your church doing this, but I'm doing this by myself. Every week I walk around all the blocks, every street in this community. I walk and I pick up the trash." And I was like, "I see you doing it, and I didn't think that you know." She was like, "I do it because I live here. I do it because this is, I won't be able to move to the upper area, the upper echelon of society. So I have to make this beautiful." I was blown. I was grieved because my church hasn't done enough. We haven't done enough to really beautify the community. Yes, we've gone through, and on special days like MLK, we did our community outreach, and that one day of the year, we do it. Well, we've done it more than once a year, but not as frequently as we could do. And the other thing is, I'm like, man, I don't engage my neighbors as much as I should. Not only they know that I'm a pastor, but they also know that I'm their neighbor. And yeah, they'll be knocking. They do knock on the door every now and then, and I'm like, I'm available. I need to be doing more. I didn't mean to get off on this tangent, but I do want to give my assessment 5 years later. First thing, we must better engage our local law enforcement with our young black men. There are ways we can do that, and I stated we can partner. We must partner more, and I say we must partner more because I see this as a crisis. We must partner more with local law enforcement, get them into our spheres of influence. So if that's a church, get them into your church. If it's a community center, get them in your community center. If it's a tutoring program, get them in your tutoring program. Whatever it is, get them present. Presence will give them another view of law enforcement where they won't be afraid. Because I'm still black, and every now and then if a cruiser gets behind me, I get nervous, I get afraid, and I'm like, if I get pulled over, what I'm going to do, even though I know what to do, I still have that anxiety. And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is the case. So we can, one, engage our local law enforcement with our young black men and our young black girls, young black boys, young black girls. Two, we must do a better job of engaging ourselves. Because I practice family systems approach to therapy and counseling, I understand that, and as Christians, we preach the family. The church is nothing more than a big family in and of itself. But we must re-engage. We have to know ourselves better. If we are going to advocate for our community, we must know our community better than anybody else. That begins with both the individual and the family that make up the community. We got to know our neighbors. We got to engage our neighbors. We got to engage our neighbors' children. I love the fact that I now, and I'm sorry to admit, I now know my neighbor's name. And I live in a neighborhood where, the turnover is high. So people don't stay long it's short-term housing for the most part. So somebody may stay there 6 months and move. Somebody might stay there a year and move. There is high turnover. It's really hard, really difficult to make a connection because there are not as many homeowners as there once were. And you may say that doesn't have any relevance on it, but as my neighbor who is picking up the trash shows me that it matters. She wants her house to be, and her house is beautiful compared to what it was when she bought it. And how she's made it, I've seen the transformation in the short time that she's lived there. And she wants that to reflect who she is as an individual. So we got to engage ourselves. What does that engagement look like? One, if you're a parent, know your child. Plain and simple. Know your child. Know who they hang out with. Know what, if they play video games, know what video games they're playing that may be influencing their thinking. Know the music they listen to. And I know, it's different from when our generation, because when my parents were listening, they found out the music we were listening, that at the time it was burgeoning gangster rap music, NWA, Ice-T and all that. They were afraid. Now, I didn't turn out to be gangster. I've never been gangster enough. Neither did a lot of we had the neighborhood cliques that wanted to be gangs. They tried to function as gangs, probably saw themselves, this was during the time of, I don't know if you remember that documentary Banging in Little Rock. I've got to meet one of the stars in that movie. I hate to call it that, but he's reformed gangster now and doing very well in outreach ministry there in Little Rock. But they were concerned about us. But we had neighbors. I can't tell you how many mothers I got growing up who had the authority to whip my behind. How many fathers I had growing up who had father figures who had the authority to whip my behind. No matter what block I was on, somebody was going to tell somebody else. My family was, what we were doing. We couldn't stay out of trouble too much. Because everybody, they weren't nosy neighbors. They were neighbors who understood they were part of a village. So we need to get back to that connection. And it's not hard to do. It really isn't. And I know that a lot of this is unpopular, but I'm telling you the truth. If Hillary Clinton can write a book talking about it takes a village, it becomes a bestseller, and we know she stole it from us. She got that entire phrase from us, and we don't practice that phrase that made her money. We're going to continue to see the decline of our communities to violence of all kinds, and I'm not just talking about the kind that resulted in the death of Mike Brown. Police. That's what we'll march on that. We'll protest on that. But we still have to address the gun violence that happens in our communities. And I'm not just talking about the black on black crime either. That is a part of it. I'm talking about the ones who just brandish a gun just to have it, and they have no need for it. They have no understanding of the power behind that weapon, and they just brandish it to look bad. Also, we got to talk about the domestic violence in our communities. It's infesting our communities. And yes, it happens in every community. But our community, most communities are silent about that. We got to talk about the sexual assaults that happen in our communities. Black women are more sexually trafficked than any other race. And I fact check that on me. I may be mistaken, so feel free to fact check and correct me on that. But it's high. So we got to address all of that issues. And by knowing our community, that is a way we can do it. Engaging ourselves. If I'm going to be preaching and teaching on differentiation of self, being self-differentiated and emotionally intelligent, I want it to be empowering so that we don't just know ourselves so we can feel better about ourselves, but we can be empowered, be liberated to go out and serve the community and be repairers of the breach as the Bible calls for us. We are to be repairers of the breach. So 5 years later, it's a lot to be done, but we can do it. We have the means to do it. We can, and we are turning tragedies into triumphs. We've done it with Trayvon. We've done it with many others. The nameless, countless nameless brothers and sisters who have transitioned from this world by way of violence. We know their names. We can call their names. We can give rest to them. We can end all that's happening in our community. We can do it. I'm ready to do it. Are you? Anyway, so thank you. I love to hear your comments on this. I would also invite you to support me. There's a PayPal method. There's can't even talk. There's a PayPal. There's a Patreon, and the links will be in the description. And also follow me on my social media, Twitter, and on my radio